Homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm, or welcome back. Today in the kitchen we are making cioppino. And cioppino is an Italian seafood stew that originated in San Francisco. And it's one of those things that when it is good, it is just practically life-changing. It is just sublime. And I was very intimidated to make it for a really long time. And then I finally looked up a recipe. This recipe, not surprisingly, if you followed me for any length of time, originates with America's Test Kitchen. And what I came to realize is it's one of those classic recipes where you use really, really good ingredients and it's actually quite simple. And your job is to not overcomplicate things and to just let those really good ingredients shine. And so it's actually quite simple. It comes together rather quickly. And it's a really lovely stew for celebrations or even just a weeknight meal. And it's a little like jambalaya in the sense that it's a mix of whatever you have on hand in terms of seafood. Traditionally, it will usually have some kind of chunks of fish, and then shrimp, and then some kind of shellfish or multiple kinds of shellfish. This particular batch that I'm making in this video has some tuna that was wild caught by a friend of my husband's, and he was generous enough to give us a couple of pieces of that, and some shrimp. And we are in Walla Walla, Washington, which is inland from the coast in Washington by about 4 to 4.5 hours. And surprisingly, because it's not that far, we really have a hard time getting fresh, good seafood here. And there's a company on the west side of the state called Oyster Catcher, and I happen to be on their text list, and they make a trip to Walla Walla maybe every couple of months. And it's literally one of those kind of clandestine, you meet in the parking lot and pick up your order in the back of a pickup truck. But he has incredible seafood. I'm not personally a big oyster eater. I had a really bad experience with food poisoning with a raw oyster, and I will probably never eat a raw oyster again after that. It was really bad. And then I don't love them cooked. I like a smoked oyster, but I'm not super fond of them. I find them just, it's a little too much of all the things that make it what it is. But I do absolutely love clams, and I could eat clams all the time. And so this has 2 pounds of clams in it from Oyster Catcher Seafood over on the West Coast from a drop that they did right before Christmas. This video is actually predating Christmas a little bit, and we're just putting it together a little later in terms of you guys seeing it. But you could use whatever you have on hand or whatever your store has on hand. I've made this with mussels before. Crab would be delicious if that was in season and you had that on hand. And then whatever kind of firm fish that you wanted to use, and salmon would also work. So you could use salmon, you could use halibut, you could use cod, whatever your store had. And it doesn't have to be fresh, it could be frozen, but home-grown tomatoes. So we're using some of our home canned heirloom tomatoes in this dish. And then just garlic, a little bit of white wine in which to steam the clams, which gives it kind of a traditional flavor, and then a little bit of oregano. And so really quite simple in terms of seasonings, but everything just shines, and it is so good, you guys. So cioppino, let's get started.
So we're going to start out here with some nice olive oil and a couple of large onions diced. And we're just going to saute those up with a little bit of salt and pepper until everything is cooked through and translucent. Here's our beautiful 2 pounds of fresh clams, our fresh tuna, and I would guess about half of a pound of shrimp, and then our homegrown heirloom tomatoes. And then towards the end of cooking, we're going to want to add 4 cloves of minced garlic. Give that about 30 seconds to a minute, just until it starts becoming fragrant. You don't want to overcook it. And then I'm not sure why the recipe calls for this, but you add about 1/4 cup of water to this recipe and just let those onions soften up even more and steam in that water before you add the rest of the ingredients. A couple of bay leaves, a teaspoon of dried oregano, a eighth to a quarter teaspoon of red pepper flakes, and then a quart of home canned tomatoes or a typical 28-ounce can of whole peeled tomatoes. And then I'm just breaking those up a little bit with my spatula. I don't want them to be completely pureed. And then into this, I'm going to poach that beautiful tuna. And this was still a little bit frozen, so I cooked this for about 15 minutes once it came back to a full simmer. And then I removed these so that they didn't continue to cook because I didn't want them to dry out. Here's our gorgeous clams. These got rinsed well, and then I'm looking for any broken clams, and those are getting set aside. If it's broken, it's dead, and that's not going to be good eats, and potentially it's going to be very bad eats, so you want to pick those guys out. 4 tablespoons of melted butter, a cup and a quarter of dry white wine, and then we're going to put our clams into this mixture and cover and let them start to steam. I think the original recipe called for a pound of clams and a pound of mussels, and I just substituted 2 pounds of clams. And this takes less than 5 minutes, and it's kind of magic. It's a little bit like popcorn, but with clams. So they are just going to steam in that lovely wine mixture and open up their shells. And the trick here is, with any seafood really, is not to overcook it. And so you just want these to steam enough to where they're finished cooking. Once everything is open, it's done. And if you have any clams that don't open, that's an indication that it was dead, and you want to toss any that don't open. So do not pry open any unopened clams and use the meat, because that's not going to be good. And then you can just throw the whole clam with the shell into the soup. That's how it's traditionally served in typical restaurants. I find that really fiddly. I don't necessarily want to get my fingers in a seafood and pick out individual clams. And so I just went ahead and did this all at once. And so I'm just picking the clam meat out of each one of these clams, and I'm making sure that I'm putting all of the juice into this stew. I think the original recipe called for an 8-ounce bottle of clam juice, and I didn't happen to have that, and so I just skipped it. And then once those are all in there, we're going to poach our shrimp. And again, you don't want to overcook your shrimp. You just want them to be cooked through and tender. And so 5 minutes max. And then I'm going to strain my clam broth and wine and butter into the rest of our stew. Clams can be a little bit gritty and a little bit sandy. And so if you don't want that sand on the bottom of the pot, it's a good idea to give that a strain. Most of it will just sink to the bottom. And then once these shrimp are fully cooked, which they are now, we're going to add in our shredded cooked tuna. And that's all there is to it, you guys. This really comes together fast. It's not an inexpensive meal if you're using some really nice seafood, but it is done in less than a half an hour. So give this recipe a try. If you're hungering for some seafood, or maybe you want to have a nice celebration dinner, it's definitely worth it. And I completely failed to get a video shot of me dishing this lovely dinner up. So you're just going to have to use your imaginations and make it yourself. Thanks for watching, Tribe. If you like this kind of content, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, leave me a comment, and share. I have new content coming out every week.